Our next speaker guest decided to speak sitting down, actually, not standing up. That's why we're sitting like this for the moment, and I'd like to introduce him to you now for a minute or two before his talk. He teaches philosophy at École Nationale Supérieure d'Art in Cergy, in the northwestern suburb of Paris. Political philosophy, as we will hear in just a minute, is one of his core interests, but also cultural sociology. He's very outspoken about French politics, has written manifests and articles with Édouard Louis, with whom he is often associated, along with Didier Eribon, whose Retour à Reims went global, so to speak, as many books of all three mentioned do, actually. He has written about Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, but also about the three heroes of anti-surveillance, so to speak. The book was called L'Art de la Révolte, Snowden, Assange, and Manning in 2015, Die Kunst der Revolte in German. Also translated in numerous languages, is a book that informs his talk today a little bit, I would say. Juger, l'état pénal face à la sociologie, Judge and Punish in English, actually. It came out in the US last year, early last year, and Verurteilen in German at Suhrkamp. Regarding the protest of the movement of les Gilets jaunes, Gelbwesten or Yellow Vests in English, he can be seen protesting along with Louis and with the Committee of Adama, which is a sort of equivalent to Black Lives Matter in France. There's also a forthcoming book, I think in April, that is called Le Combat Adama, the Adama fight, which he co-wrote actually with Assa Traoré, whose brother was killed by the police, he writes. His talk today is called Can We Be in Favor of Violence? Soyez bienvenus. Please welcome Geoffroy de la Gannerie.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here. Thank Toby for introduction, and Susan, Laura, Evin, and everyone who was, and Pascal who was involved in organizing this conference. So as you will see, my accent is really bad, and I'm completely exhausted and tired. So I have decided not to stand because it's too formal for me. So I sit, and I will show my. In fact, Martin did that in Paris a few weeks ago. So that's a very good idea. So we'll show my text on the screen, and so if you can't understand what I say, you can understand what you read. Let's go. So I would today like to pose the questions concerning the links between violence and thought, between violence and our positions as the political subjects. And I believe that in fact to broach such subjects is to broach the theme of honesty and of frankness. It's to be confronted with the problem of sincerity as it pertains to one's relationship to oneself when one thinks and fancies the world and conceives of oneself as a political subject, that is, a subject that wills and acts. I believe violence is a very paradoxical issue for thought. It's one of the themes that haunt the space of culture, the space of politics, the space of philosophy. It's a question that haunts us as a subject. But this haunting is paradoxical. Because in fact, we constantly seek to escape violence, to escape the question of violence, as emerges particularly clearly from the fact that we never cease attributing violence to others. Violence is the other. It's what cannot be accepted, that from which what distances oneself, what one acts and thinks against, what one seeks to curtail, to bring to an aid, to combat. Thought's relation to violence is one of negation and rejection. As if, whenever it is a matter of thinking about violence, the goal of thoughts turns out in fact to be that of employing diversionary tactics that allow one to skirt the issue, to make the problem disappear, to establish distance between the subject and violence. One thing I find striking is the degree to which, within the cultural or political field, all of us consistently use the term violence as a negative term. A certain rhetorical dispositive is very much in evidence in the realm of culture. It consists in formulating a critique of the social that turns on the term violence, and even of treating what is at fault, what should be transformed, and what is violent as synonymous. It is enough to describe something as violent for what one says to be considered critical. What this mode of articulating critique in fact means is that as speakers, we situate ourselves on the side of non-violence. We accord ourselves the privilege of being able to attribute violence to others, thereby implicitly situating ourselves in the field of non-violence, with all the symbolic benefits that follow from this. In challenging this stance, I'm obviously also challenging myself. So this is the slide we skip. Okay. So is this an honest and sincere position? Or rather, does it take all aspects of the problem of politics into account? If we wish to understand our situation as political subjects that sometimes act and sometimes call for the passing of new laws, do we then not need to confront the question of our relationship to the exercise of violence? The moment we understand that political and social relations are relations of force, and that we cannot absolve ourselves for all responsibility with regard to the law, as we would thereby be leaving the state apparatus to our adversaries, we must confront with the question of our relation to violence. We have to be honest with ourselves. Any theorist who overvalues non-violence is taking the easy road and failing to engage with concrete problems unless he confronts this question. We need to think through what it means to act politically, to will politically, and what we feel out to be the criteria on which to base political action. All clear-sighted political thought must engage with an ethical issue. We cannot escape the fact of being potentially in favor of violence being practiced against another, in spite of him, against his wishes, by virtue of the simple fact that he and we live in the same society and are under the sway of relations of power whose legitimacy it does not recognize. To put this differently, nothing can ever be discredited just by describing it as violent. One always needs to assess what kind of violence is being practiced, for what purpose, in whose name, and with what consequences. If we pretend that because something is violent it is at fault, we don't acknowledge the fact that violence is sometimes what we want. And so it is never sufficient to say this is violent to criticize it. In beginning this talk by addressing the question of sincerity, I meant to state that in my view there is always a certain form of insincerity at work within the position that defines itself as non-violent. I'm not claiming that authors who aspire to the creation of a non-violent society are not being honest. They are being honest. They do dream of a non-violent society, of a non-violent way of resolving conflict, and so do I, of course. Everyone dreams of the abolition of violence. Yet I am increasingly going to view any position that presents itself as non-violence or criticizes the violence of institutions based on the utopia of a society stripped of its violence as problematic. Perhaps Sartre's concept of inauthenticity should apply here. As soon as one goes to the bottom of political issues, as soon as one thinks politically, one cannot escape the question of one's relations to the exercise of violence. And as will become clear shortly, I'm increasingly uncertain as to whether political philosophy does not form a gigantic system destined not so much to shed light on our position as political subject as to obfuscate it, allowing us to skirt the question of violence and ignore the fact that all of us are already, every day, exercising violence and condoning the exercise of violence. If we want to think through violence and politics, we must rebuild the entire edifice of political philosophy. I believe the non-violent position is virtually always a position that does not fully interrogate itself. It's a way of thinking that can only appear coherent for as long as entire problems are set aside. For example, many questions occur to me when scholars or militants define themselves as non-violent and support, say, the development of ostensibly not violent forms of political action and protest. To begin with, it often seems to me that in doing so, they are in fact not being non-violent. They are simply happy to leave the monopoly on violence to the state, and when the police carry them off, beat them, evict them from a building or imprison them, they accept this without responding, so that what describes itself as non-violence is simply the sacrificial acceptance of one's own exposure to state violence and the preservation of state violence. Those who describe themselves as non-violent should really be saying, I am in favor of state's monopoly on violence, in favor of self-sacrifice. From a comprehensive and holistic perspective, to be non-violent is to assent to the preservation of the existing framework for the exercise of violence as it exists and as it imposes itself on me. To be sure, it is without doubt legitimate to point out that suffering violence is not the same as exercising it. But even here, the matter is not so simple, if only because it is always difficult to know where violence begins and where it ends. In Germany, federal courts have held that sitting in the street as an act of civil disobedience can be violent due to effects on drivers. So we can joke about this, but we also need to take seriously the notion that all forms of action we define as non-violent, strikes, squats, demonstrations, involve constraints being imposed on those whose life is affected by our actions and the route we follow. And what is more, we can point out that our demonstrations, marches, and assemblies are very often protected by the police, which shows that the use of so-called non-violent action is premised on the potential exercise of state violence against those who would attempt to interfere with what we do. But there is still another aspect. To say that one is non-violent while mobilizing in favor of, example, a legal reform or a change of government always involves knowing that other individuals do not necessarily approve to the legal and political order we would like to see established. So to put this differently, if we define ourselves as non-violent, but call for the passing of new laws, we need to know that we may have to impose the order we want by recourse to coercive means. In the same way, if we do not call for the passing of laws, if we are non-violent and withdraw from all forms of political responsibility, we leave the violence of the world as it is, and in doing so, we remain caught within a certain approval of violence. If we need to go to the street and demonstrate, even in a non-violent way, it shows that we engage in a fight against some others who don't share our views and wills, and so we are engaged in a fight against them. One could go further still. One could look into what this means for scholars, academics, and intellectuals who publicly present themselves as being hostile to violence, and in particular to state violence, and who envision a world without coercion. The simple fact that one can give a talk that presents itself as non-violent at a university and get paid by the state presupposes a system of taxation, which in turn presupposes state coercion, the persecution of tax fraudsters, which is to say state violence. Today, even the utopia of non-violence is rendered possible by state violence and the spaces of freedom and creative possibility it provides. The question of taxes is a very important one. As Walter Benjamin emphasizes, one can say that of a legal order that it is violent, not only when it has recourse to violent means in order to assert itself, but also when obedience results from the threat of sanctions. To the extent that one lives under a system that involves threats, one remains within the system of violence. The critique of violence is often reduced to the critique of the police, of prison, or of the state's repressive apparatus. It's also very common for the critique of penal violence to be based on a call for action that promises to transform social structures, to combat crime, one ought to pursue policies of social justice rather than policies of punishment or mass incarceration. To oppose the welfare state to the penal state, to oppose an approach that aims for greater social justice to one that preserves the world's inegalitarian structure and is content to punish the behavior resulting from those structures, is to invoke a classic dichotomy of the critique of state violence. But even this dichotomy seems to me problematic, for if we want more social justice, more education, more doctors, more professors, that also means we want more taxes, and taxation involves the coercion of taxpayers who would perhaps prefer not to pay any taxes if they weren't coerced. In today's world, to call for more public funding for education, healthcare, art, and academia is to call for the exercise of state violence to endorse such violence. I believe there is nothing worse for thought than what I call escapism into non-violence. That is the failure to begin one's reflection by considering the possibility that one might endorse the exercise of violence. I would like to make this remark, which seems to me a very important issue in movements against police violence in the US or France. It's an issue we debate a lot. If we ask for the repression and conviction of police officers whom we consider guilty of brutality, we are not fighting against violence. We ask to use state violence against police violence, and we are not non-violent. Let me offer another example. As you know, in November 2015, France suffered a number of highly violent terrorist attacks. The Stade de France, the Bataclan Theatre, and various cafes. Among the terrorists was Salah Abdeslam, who escaped to Belgium. Some months after he escaped, he was arrested. The arrest was violent. He was injured, dragged away, blindfolded, hurled inside a police truck. When he was arrested, he suffered a form of violence. Now that he is in prison, he is suffering another form of violence. From his point of view, he was kidnapped, and now he is imprisoned. But can I speak of this violence without acknowledging that on this day, I was relieved to see him arrested? I won't say I was happy, only that within that particular context, I find it difficult to imagine anyone not being in favor of Salah Abdeslam's arrest. And I think it is only honest to say so. One may, like myself, be very active in contemporary social movements against police violence. One may even be very close to movements advocating the abolition of the police and of prisons. But even so, could one honestly and publicly state that on that particular occasion, one disapproved of state violence? And so the question that poses itself to a progressive intellectual becomes, does one approve of this violence being exercised against this particular person? What system of values I have to elaborate to acknowledge the fact that, to me, it is legitimate that the state arrests Salah Abdeslam and does so in my name? This is a key issue, and the challenge for me is to be both honest and radical. To put this in what may be a simplistic term, I would say that one reason why today the left is weak by comparison to the right is that the right is cruel and violent and makes no bones about it, whereas the left is ill at ease with violence. One senses something insincere about it, and we have yet to develop a sufficient honest and coherent discourse on these very complicated issues. The fact we have not developed a coherent discourse on violence is not a coincidence or an accident. It may rather result from the very conceptual architecture of political philosophy and political thought, since I would say social contract theory. I believe there is something in our political thought that prevents us from thinking violence, and that if we wish to confront this question directly, we must in fact develop a new political episteme. In his book on sovereignty, Daniel Loic stresses the fact that political theory has always linked the law and violence. It has always believed there is a logical link between the two. And Loic calls for us to imagine the possibility of law without legal coercion, particularly in the legal practice of Judaism. In other texts, he also proposes envisioning international law as an instrument by which to resolve conflict without recourse to violence. I believe Daniel Loic's work is very important, but I'm not sure I agree with him entirely. I do not believe that political theory is a theory of the violence of the law. I'm even increasingly asking myself whether, behind its rational, abstract, and disembodied appearance, political philosophy may not itself be the expression of the quasi-psychological terror its authors suffer when having to engage directly with the question of what it means to be a political subject. Political philosophy is the expression of these authors' desire to avoid a situation in which they might have to publicly admit that they do, in some cases, support violence. There is a kind of anguish at the core of traditional political theory. Violence is not the theme philosophers give center stage in their theories. they focus rather on the theme of legitimacy. Among the essential undertakings pursued by this discourse are that of analyzing the condition of legitimacy of institutions and that of identifying the reasons why social actors owe allegiance to these institutions. And yet, when one thinks about it, and given that social actors don't read political theory, what is the point of saying that institutions are legitimate, if not that of furnishing oneself with a clean conscience, of justifying the state's repressive apparatus? It is ultimately not just a matter of saying, I show that the law is legitimate and that it should therefore be obeyed. Too bad if some people act differently than the law requires. It's normal to punish them, and I don't any longer have to pose myself the question of the exercise of state violence. Political theorists know quite well that there will be prisons, judges, and police forces, but they enact a problematic shift from the question of violence to the question of legitimacy in order no longer to have to address these phenomena as problems and thereby to be able to let them function undisturbed. In saying that there is such a thing as the legitimacy of institutions, theorists are enacting a kind of escapism into legitimacy that allows one no longer to consider that condoning the law will entail exercising violence against those who oppose it. This escapism into legitimacy is very clear in Max Weber's work too. It appears in the fact that he defines the state as the organization that holds the monopoly of legitimate violence, but that he will never give us a theory of violence and only a theory of legitimacy. The fact that political theory is characterized throughout by a fear of addressing violence emerges clearly from the fact that reflections on the state almost always aim to make the state a non-violent entity. One finds within political theory an entire range of rhetorical strategies by which to deny the violent character of state violence. These strategies tend in particular to draw a distinction between state action and the actions by which we relate to one another in our everyday lives, in order then to claim that, in the end, when the state imposes constraints on us, there is no violence involved, since we are simply imposing constraints upon ourselves via the state. At the basis of the legal order is supposed to be rational or intersubjective, there will always be a kind of non-violence of the state. The notion of the state presupposes that the state is non-violence. When it acts as a state, respecting the procedures and regulations on which it is based, the result can never be violence. Violence prevents to the private domain, that of civil society. This operation of fetishizing and promoting the state reaches its pinnacle in distinction Hannah Arendt believes necessary between power and violence. She considers power to be the manifestation of a collective will developed through deliberative operations, whereas violence refers to instrumental mechanisms of domination, constraint, and imposition. And one finds the same dispositif in Derrida's Force of Law, who distinguishes between non-violent force, which he considers legitimate, and violence, which he considers illegitimate. But one need only assume a different perspective to challenge the validity of the undertaking that distinguishes between the force of the state and violence. Description of the state should reject distinctions between force and violence or between illegitimate and legitimate violence, as if state violence were of a different nature than private violence. These dichotomies collapse as soon as one situates oneself on the side of those who become the object of repressive action and of state violence. For these people, being arrested by the police is essentially no different than being kidnapped by a gang. There is no ontological difference. Without wanting it, without accepting it, without even having consented to be part of this world and subject to these laws, some people show up, break down my door, feel authorized to impose their will on me. For the person who suffers violence, such an intervention resembles any other act of aggression. Someone deploys force to constrain me to do their will. There is no difference between a group of mafiosi, one's father, the policeman, and the judge. When the state acts, a will external to me addresses me and constrains me to behave a certain way. To think the law is not violent amounts to forgetting that for the person suffering it, a state intervention is an interaction like any other. It's a relation between two competing wills who confront one another. This is the reason why, in Judge and Punish, I have claimed one cannot understand the state without recognizing that state violence and private violence are equivalent and even identical. One must be able to affirm that the state does not simply condemn to death but murders, that it does not arrest individuals but kidnaps them, that it does not impose fines but robs, that it does not search an apartment but breaks into it. Okay. Michel Foucault says somewhere that judges are obsessed with confessions and never cease calling on the accused to admit to all charges, as the confession, of course, spares a judge having to go through the act of judging and taking upon himself the violence judgment implies. The same logic is at work in the attempt of political theorists to make it seem as if the law had been willed by those who in fact have not willed it. Theorists search for instruments by which to legitimate the law in order not to have to face up the irremediably violent aspect of the legal order to which they subscribe. I don't know if it's too long. Okay. Ah, okay.
You're fine.
It's okay? Because I'm tired, so I don't know if it's not too annoying. C'est bien. Il reste un quart d'heure, c'est bon? 15 minutes, c'est okay? Can I drink your glass?
Oh,
yeah. Okay. Because I finished mine. I have just spoken of traditional political theory and we'll return to it. But before doing so, a brief aside to emphasize the following. The fear of violence and the form of insincerity I've described can also be found among many political radicals, to whom I often feel great kinship and whom I support, anti-fascist and black bloc activists. These activists will sometimes have recourse to forms of protest that are characterized as violent, as we have seen in the G20 summit in Hamburg. They may also use violence against fascist groups with the goal of banishing them from public space, physically attacking such groups or destroying their spaces. We know the motto, no platform for fascists. When these activists opt in favor of such physical action, they virtually never use the term violence. They too deny the truth about their actions and prefer using the categories of self-defense or people self-defense. En France, on dit l'auto-défense. Thus, they conceive of their action as being merely a reaction to an anterior structure of physical violence. These activists think of their own action as a way of defending oneself against violence. The category of self-defense is a manner of avoiding an honest confrontation with the truth of one's action. The distinction between violence and self-defense perform the same psychological function as the distinction between violence and power, or between illegitimate violence and legitimate force. I believe I'm not mistaken in saying that militant anti-fascist activists have little in common with Habermas. I'm very happy of this sentence. And yet, one finds in both the very same operation of denying one's relation to violence and producing misnomers. It is in this sense that we can speak here of a common relation to violence within our discursive field. When considering a discursive field of our universe, we must not concentrate on what spontaneously strikes us as most important, presenting itself to our gaze as that which matters, which is to say oppositions and differences. We must direct our attention a little lower and examine what individuals agree on and what they do not debate, but rather share. And what speakers agree on today is that violence ought to be avoided. Political action imposes on others something they do not wish. Whatever measures we wish to see introduced, they will be deployed in this sense. We cannot escape violence. The notion of non-violence is devoid of any political meaning. This is the reason why we must also reject the Weberian notion of legitimate violence, which might to be said to constitute the final attempt to evade the truth of politics. Weber defines the state as a group whose defining feature is that it lays claim to the monopoly of the legitimated use of physical violence. But the notion of legitimate violence is self-destructive. It makes no sense. One might explain this as follows. There are only two possibilities. Either people recognize the political order as legitimate, accepting the rationality or validity of law and the institution, and in this case they are behaving the way the political order expects them to. If institutions are legitimate, the law is respected, and so there is no delinquency and hence no state violence. So where there is legitimacy, there is no violence. And conversely, as soon as there is violence, there is no longer legitimacy. What we have is a confrontation between competing wills. If state violence is brought to bear upon an individual, it's because this individual has acted in a way that is contrary to an order he does not want and has never wanted to belong to, an order he does not recognize. Delinquency is an expression of our exteriority with regards to legitimacy, and repression is a form of action that asserts the will of one another in spite of us. In authorizing an act that exposes him to the violent reaction of the group Weber calls the state, the individual has authored a sort of declaration of independence with regard to the space of legitimacy. As Henkelsen says, the fundamental political problem is not that of individuals who discuss, deliberate, or negotiate among themselves in order to establish an organized collective. Politics appear at the moment of confrontation between someone's will and what the law demands. In effect, if there is no deviation, if what the legal order requires and what I want is identical, the question of politics disappears. My will and the law are identical, so that when I obey the law, I obey myself. But what if we are not in agreement, and if we don't like the word produced by the law? It's then that there appears the problem of what it means to live under a legal order and to be citizen of a state. In eliminating these questions, political philosophy becomes an instrument by which to make political problems disappear. To link reflection on politics to an investigation of legal forms that are universally recognized by the subject subordinated to them is to abandon the space in which political queries can be formulated. It is to think about the state and the law by constructing problems in which a way that there is no longer any problem. But for me, to think politics is to mourn the possibility of reconciliation. We cannot seek approval of our wishes in the gaze of the other. We must not expect to see in the other's eyes an endorsement of the order we want. We can no longer convince ourselves the exercise of violence will meet with the approval of those who suffer it. We must face up to the divisive aspects of law. We must be able to justify the exercise of violence ourselves. Politics is a monologue. And because the question of politics arises when the subject clashes with the legal order, development of political theory necessarily requires that we rid ourselves of a certain form of legitimism that we have been in the grip of for as long as we have been thinking about the state. As soon as we reflect upon politics, our attention is directed at places, things, or subjects that appear to us as representatives. The place of politics might be Parliament, the presidential palace, the Supreme Court, and so on. The political subject par excellence might be the member of Parliament, the President of the Republic, or in extreme cases, the judge of the Constitutional Court. In fact, political theory standard individual should not be the member of Parliament, the judge, or the president. It ought to be another figure, which is, however, almost entirely absent from political theory's canonical work, or marginalized: the delinquent, the terrorist, the thief, the undocumented immigrant, the left-wing radical, the anarchist. One might say that the man arrested by the police ought to be made political theory standards reference, and that it is starting from him that our examination of the man not arrested should begin. And yet, traditionally, theory is formulated by positing legal and political principle, and it is only as an afterthought that the question of crime and the criminal are raised. This is as much as the model of Hobbes' Leviathan or as Rousseau's social contract. In John Rawls, there is simply no theory of delinquency. We need to reverse this perspective, starting from crime and the criminal, from his subjectivity and life, in order then to develop the concept of law and the legal system. In No Name in the Street, James Baldwin stresses that if one wishes to understand how justice operates in a society, one must not speak to policemen, judges, lawyers, or members of the middle class leading sheltered lives. One must rather look to the individuals who are, as it were, without shelter, without protections, those whom it would be just for the law to protect: Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, people of color, poor people. They are the ones whose opinion of justice and its workings we should be inquiring to, and it is starting from their testimonies that one might answer the question of whether our societies dispose of a concept of justice. In the same way, if we want to understand how the law works, if we want to develop an adequate concept of the law, we must examine the experience of those who are confronted by the law. What is a political subject? What figure or image of the subject should we start from in formulating political theory? In my view, the fundamental political scene is not that of a law being passed in Parliament. It's a scene that plays out every day, that of a policeman breaking down someone's door in the morning, and of this someone being hurled to the ground, naked, handcuffed, kidnapped, bound, interrogated, and detained. Political experience is not the moment when I negotiate or enter into a contract. It is the moment when I get arrested. Salah Abdeslam is a more important figure for political theory than the President of the National Assembly. In this talk, I have not, it's just 2 minutes, I have not pronounced myself in favor of prison, the police, the penal state, war, or state violence in all its contemporary forms. I've rather said that the dichotomy violence-non-violence is a dichotomy devoid of political meaning, what we can only waste our time on. I have also said that political theory constitutes a dispositif that prevents us from addressing the question of violence in a satisfactory manner, and that this question forces us to change the way we engage in political thought. To be sure, we all dream of a reconciled world, but in a world of antagonism, and moreover of plural, diffuse, multiple antagonisms, it is unavoidable fact that being in favor of certain political forms is to be in favor of dispositives that will meet with opposition from other individuals or groups. The only question what needs to pose is therefore the question of a genuine critique of violence. What type of violence can I exercise, in what way, and against whom? To put this differently, it will win us a lot of time to eliminate non-violence from our thinking and set to work directly on an analytic of violence. Thank you very much.